pozdrav vsem, ga bom kar predstavila v angleščini, to je zdaj že nekako ustaljena navada postala. Vlane, hvala, da ste prišli. Naš gost danes prihaja iz Dunaja, tako kot že prejšnji v Kuzmani. Danes imamo pa tukaj Johannesa Matesa, so I'll shift to English now. He's a historian focusing mainly in the fields of history of technology, history of knowledge, partially also to history of science, I guess. In terms of territories, his focus is Central and also Eastern Europe both, but he looks at them through the global lens. So he tries to search for global entanglements when it comes to these regions. He is a recipient of many fellowships, most recently Marie Curie and Humboldt Fellowship, also numerous awards, and he's been a visiting researcher in many places across the globe, which I will not dive into because I wouldn't want to steal your precious time. But what is important, I believe, for ZRC SAZU is that Johannes is the Secretary General of the International Union of Speleology, which is based in Postojna at the Research Institute of ZRC SAZU, which I guess you're acquainted with. I didn't know that historians also have this side hobbies of speleology, and to a degree managed to combine both, as we will see. And not least, he now leads a project at the Institute of Cultural Studies at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and has a forthcoming book in which he'll focus on the collaborative research in Imperial Vienna. The time frame is between 1850 and 1925. So I try to be very brief, not to take much of your time, but the floor is all yours now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this very, very kind introduction. And thank you so much for having me. I have to say that I have a very long and deep relationship to Slovenia and its people, and I'm very, very thankful to be here. So I would like to start right away with my presentation with a quotation by Franz Benedikt Hermann, an Austro-Russian mining engineer and naturalist who traveled through the karst region. And he reported, "The karst is a living picture of desolation, transcending all imagination. An area of at least 2 by 3 German miles in extent, bordered by sheer naked karst rocks, contains nothing but 1 million stones left over from receding flood." I think there are not so many examples where such a small region became the holotype for a whole phenomenon, a global phenomenon. And here on this picture you see all the karst regions which exist in the world. Karst terrains cover about 20% of the Earth's dry, ice-free surface and contribute up to 25% of the total drinking water supply of the world. So karst is a global phenomenon, and it's very, very important. I don't think I have to explain you about karst terrain. You all know that, different types, features, ponors, polys, and so on, caves. And today we will have a look on the region where this term, as you all know, comes from, Slovenia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And as you see, it's this empire, when it existed, was a very, very complex entity. It composed of various different crown lands, provinces, 11 different languages, nationalities, and various karst areas within its semi-peripheries or peripheries. And all these karst areas have a few characteristics in common, like economically not well developed, multinational populations, and most of these regions were at borderlands, and there was a huge military interest involved in researching these areas. And you can see here some of these karst areas. Geoscience in a multinational framework. In the Habsburg monarchy, science wasn't isolated from global trends. However, it was closely entwined with the state. In the 1850s and 1860s, large-scale undertakings, surveys, collections, aimed to determine and dismantle disparities within the empire and legitimize its territorial framework as a supranational unit. This focus changed with the reorientation of the Habsburg foreign policy after German unification in 1871. Many institutions turned their intra-imperial projects inside out, in the so-called Orient, the Adriatic, the Arctic, and so on. And here on the left, you can see a map. It's not a map of the different languages of the empire, it's a map of the different soils of the empire. So the empire was also composed by very different landscapes. And in blue, you see here the karst regions, also limestone regions. And when we have a look in the special specialities of science in this multinational empire, most of the science was state-driven, but mostly privately funded. In Vienna, there was a strong support for the natural sciences because there was the idea that the natural sciences are just doing objective work, and humanities were very strong, supported in the crown lands of the empire, especially in Budapest, Prague, especially in language studies, but also history. So you have here a very strong differentiation. What is also very interesting that internationalism and nationalism appeared at the same time in the empire. So, and often they were brought forward by the same people, but at different locations. So internationalism, nationalism is not separated. We have in the Habsburg Empire a very, very early science popularization, which starts in the 1840s, and a rather late science professionalization. What do I mean with professionalization? So to be a university professor becomes very late a unique profession. So you have a long gap about from 1840 to 1880, where especially scientific societies where different people, naturalists, women, and so on, could contribute to scientific work. So we call it today amateurs. And we have in the empire a different model of colonialism. Of course, the empire had no overseas colonies, but there was an internal colonial framework and, of course, power imbalances within the empire. When we look on the history of karstology, there is a very close focus on one person. This is the Serbian geoscientist Jovan Cvijić, and his work, Das Karstphänomen, the Karst Phenomenon, which was published in 1893. And this was considered as an accomplishment of a young, ingenious researcher with a groundbreaking PhD thesis. And this PhD thesis was done in Vienna, the Vienna University. And his work was considered as purely scientific, so no influence from political ideas, and seen in stark contrast to his ethnographical studies, especially about the people in the later Yugoslavian state. And this is considered as very political. And in my talk, I will try to make a new approach and look on the different collaborators in this idea to make the karst a global phenomenon, a global holotype. And this, I would like to show, was driven by political and cultural contexts. And I will look closely on how here ecological thinking, Orientalism, and also colonial expansive claims of the Habsburg Empire somehow were entangled. And in the end, I would like to look at the establishment of the karst model through an nationalization, but also an internationalization process. So I have here pictured some of the recent works which were done on the history of karst geomorphology. I would like to mention especially the works here on the right-hand side done by geologists from Slovenia and geographers from the Geographical Institute, very profound works. In my talk, I will ask the following questions. With regard on karst communities, I will ask under which changing conditions, goals and profit expectations did different stakeholders engage in karst research? With regard to ecology and Orientalism, I will examine how did holistic thinking and stereotypical images of karst areas as wastelands converge in the development of the karst model. And with regards to internationalism and nationalism, I ask, what does this mean for establishing the classical karst as a world reference site, and how did discipline formation in geosciences and agricultural research influence this process? And in the end, I would like to give you maybe a sort of answer if this karst model was a tool for empire building. I aim to reframe these early steps in karst geomorphology as a collaborative effort by local, regional, and transnational practitioners driven by public benefit and personal gain. I also argue for re-recognizing the political dimensions in establishing the classical karst as a model for dissolutional phenomena and understanding this development as a power-related interaction supported by a close transnational community of geoscientists and imperial stakeholders. And I will analyze this on 3 different levels. First, I will give a look on the karst research when it was done under the Habsburg Empire as a sort of imperial undertaking. Then I will give a look on the synthesis and systematization around Cvijić's karst phenomenon. And in the end, I will speak about the establishment of the classical karst as a type area. So let's start with the origins of karst research as an imperial undertaking. Railroads linking Vienna with the Adriatic, Alps and Balkans brought karst areas within reach, and public and private interests in their exploitation to the fore, as tourist sites, as water sources, or as forestry and agricultural lands. Karst knowledge relied not only on field studies by experts, but also on local and indigenous knowledge of subsurface topography, hydrogeographical conditions, or cultivation practices. And here you can see some of the scholars who did this first work on karst research. I would like to mention especially Friedrich Simony, who was the first geographer at the University of Vienna. And before he got this position as first professor, he worked on the Dachstein mountain, which is a mountain region between Styria and Upper Austria. And there he first used the term karst, to describe the development of a karst landscape. This was in the 1840s. In the same time, he also introduced this term for the Moravian karst around Brno today in the Czech Republic. And from time to time, there was also a very important figure like Adolf Schmiedl, who traveled around the karst areas of the monarchy and worked about the caves which existed there. And from these early efforts in the 1840s, 1850s, there were travelers going to the southeastern part of Europe who introduced also the term karst to different regions of the empire, and also beyond in the Ottoman Empire. And this is especially Amur Boué, who was a very important traveler, and then Emil Tietze, who was the director of the Imperial Geological Survey in Vienna. And this term was introduced, as you can see, the whole Ottoman Empire until Palestine in the 1860s and 1870s. So already very, very early before the karst phenomenon was written. Apart from the aforementioned individual ventures, the founding of empire-wide scientific institutions in the 1850s Vienna, especially the Geological Survey and the Geographical Society, made the karst areas of the Habsburg monarchy the object of collaborative work. Large-scale scientific ventures aim to identify and resolve disparities within the monarchy, legitimize its framework as both a natural and cultural entity amidst internal and external crises. The use of the term karst as a unifying concept for diverse territories created a framework for imperial identity. Subsequent mapping of karst areas throughout the Balkans and the Middle East was a precursor to the internationalization of this model. And with the early ecological studies of Joseph Lorenz, later he became an aristocrat and named Josepha Lorenza von Liburnaua, the notion of karst as an environment threatened by deforestation and water scarcity gained prominence. Noting that the lack of vegetation in the so-called Croatian karst is a result of historical overexploitation, Lorenz developed the vision of karst terrains as a landscape type where hydrological, soil and climatic conditions are interdependent. Josepha Lorenza worked as a school teacher for a long time in Fiume, and there he had a lot of time to explore the karst areas around the city, and he also did some very early ecological work on sea organisms and how physical conditions were interrelated with physical conditions. So very interesting work. Inspired by Lorenz, state authorities engaged in the so-called reforestation and cultivation of karst areas. Behind these cross-regional efforts to transform entire landscapes from their so-called neglected state to a more human one were stereotypical images of the Balkans as the so-called European Orient, embodied Habsburg policymakers' notion of the empire as a cultural state and its civilizing mission towards the East. So, and this also explains why the karst landscapes are often depicted, I will show you later a picture, as wastelands, as deserts where nobody is living. So this is very strongly related with these Orientalist ideas. With the Eastern Alps opened to tourism and pipelines supplying Vienna with water from karst aquifers, public interest surged in both surface and subsurface karst environments. And in Vienna in the 1880s, there were three different interpretations in the public discourse about karst. There was once the local toponym related to the karst area in Slovenia, then a geographical landscape type, and then also an idea of karst as a geological formation of the ground. And you can see here also the opening of the Vienna high spring water pipe, which was a huge step towards recognizing karst as a supplier of water. And here you see a very, very problematic work on the karst area of military Croatia, border to the Ottoman Empire. And it's also called in the title, "And the Rescue of this Area," because there was an idea that these areas are not well cultivated because of the Slavic-speaking population, and the idea was to recultivate this area, and then the German-speaking population has a right to appropriate these areas. And this was closely related to the idea of cultural work. The term is Kulturarbeit in German, and this was introduced by a very famous geographer in Vienna, Albrecht Penck. Albrecht Penck, he became then a professor of geography at the University of Vienna after Simoni, whom I have mentioned earlier, and he was 26 years old at this time. He came from Germany, and he had this idea of cultural work. And the karst model became a very important governance tool within the empire. While scientists investigated karst formations to enhance understanding and generalize processes related to earth and the environment, for the bureaucracy it became a governance tool, facilitating the transfer of forestry, land and water management projects tested in one karst area to others. So let's move now to the synthesis and systematization around Cvijić's karst phenomenon. The author of this problematic work I pointed to you at the last slide, this rescue of the Croatian karst, was Josef Vesely. Josef Vesely was director of the Forestry Academy in Mariabrunn, and he was a very important figure also in the Imperial Royal Ministry of Agriculture. And he promoted the so-called karst question in the empire and its rescue for the German population. And he was also very much involved in the foundation of the Hochschule für Bodenkultur. Today it's the University of Life Sciences in Vienna. Karst cultivation projects undertaken by early forestry researchers and authorities in various Habsburg groundlands laid the foundation for the transformation of the Forestry Academy in Mariabrunn into the Hochschule für Bodenkultur in Vienna in 1872, with classes in agronomy, forestry, and so-called cultural engineering. The term in German is Kulturtechnik. And the opening of the main building of this Hochschule was in 1896, just a few years after the cast phenomenon was published. And in around 1819, Jovan Cvijić, the Serbian geologist, geographer, came to Vienna. At these days, as I told you, explained you, karst was a very hot topic in the Habsburg Empire, and especially two scientists were very closely involved. The first one, the more senior one, was Eduard Suess. You see him here in the middle. He is very famous for writing a multi-volume book, Das Antlitz der Erde, the face of the earth, where he tried to bring together local results of geological surveys to one global view of the earth, which was very, very famous, but also very much criticized. And the second guy is Albrecht Benck, this young German professor, 26 years old. He came to Vienna and he was very, very energetic, and he became a lot of enemies in Vienna. And the problems what these guys worked with is they wanted to concentrate they want to develop geography, which was considered as a field between statistics, a bit history and other fields, and they wanted to make a new scientific basis for geography, especially Albrecht Benck. And this should be done by geomorphology. Benck introduced field research techniques in geography, a sort of observation culture. He was the first who did student excursions with students to the mountainous areas and to work there on the karst landscapes. And with this idea to make large-scale synthesis work was also the question, how do we get trustful data? Because when we have to implement a lot of data of local researchers, it's often not clear, is this data really correct, especially when it's done by amateurs. So standardization was a big issue and global outreach. So having graduated in natural sciences from the Velika Škola, grade school in Belgrade, Jovan Cvijić moved to Vienna in 1889 on a scholarship from the Serbian ministry and attended lectures at the University of Vienna for 6 semesters. Similar to his teachers, Albrecht Benck and Eduard Suess, Cvijić aimed to synthesize all existing research on karst landforms in a summarizing monograph, drawing on both personal observations and literary sources. And as a participant of Benck's excursions, Cvijić learned to identify, analyze, and reinterpret landscape features. However, validation, comparison, and generalization of research data, especially when derived from non-professional sources, posed huge methodological changes. So there was a big need for credibility. So the need for credibility was particularly pronounced in the controversial field of geomorphology, which emerged as a new subdiscipline during the geologization of geography in the 1880s. Geomorphology provided a new empirical basis for the diverse field of university geography, which was previously molded by a range of historical, statistical, and topographical approaches. So Cvijić implemented 3 different strategies of building trust in his own work. He restricted the scope to surface landforms, so nothing about caves. But when you look in his works, he writes a lot about caves, but he classifies them as dolines. Then he was very active in boundary work towards amateurish speleology, but he eagerly exploited their sources. So he asked a lot of speleologists all over the empire to send him material, which he put together into his PhD thesis. And he portrayed himself as a geographer dedicated to field research, although a considerable amount of his study relied on the field work done by others. So he was very successful with that. And in 1893, Das Karstphänomen was finally published. To build trust, Cvijić employed that's I already mentioned, and you can see here on the top some of the pictures he has introduced. The right one is on a doline in sedimentary deposits in eastern Serbia, and the other hand is a railway cut from at Lokatech, which became a sort of a role model for all solution dough lines. Nowadays, we know that this dough line was not formed by solution, but anyway. So the PhD thesis was not a balanced work. While karst rivers and coastal karst landforms occupied only 6 pages each, the chapter on dough lines alone, which included many vertical caves, took up half of the 112 pages. In the debate on dough line formation, unfolded between 2 fellows of the Vienna Geological Survey, Mojsiewicz and Penck's rival Tietze, Cvijić unsurprisingly supported the former's hypothesis. So he also argues for chemical erosion, so like his teacher. And another contribution is his promotion of terms borrowed from South Slavic languages such as Polye and so on. So this was basically the karst phenomenon. So let's move now to the last part of my presentation, the establishment of the classical karst as a type area. Actually, how was the work of Cvijić, which is nowadays very, very famous, received by his colleagues? He got a lot of criticism, especially from Viennese geologists, from the Geographical Society, and of course from French speleologists. Cvijic's rejection of the dough line's collapse origin earned him many opponents. French scholars proposed other terms such as phénomène du calcaire. So he was really very strongly opposed. And I have brought here with me a quotation by Edouard Alfred Martel. He's a very famous French speleologist who wrote about Cvijic's term karst. Locally, the name karst seems to be limited to Istria and Western Carniola, so arid in places that it has to be nicknamed Austria's Arabia Petrea, which was the name for a Roman province in Arabia. So you can see here also this Orientalism. All that the karst proper can claim is to have been the first ground where subterranean hydrology was scientifically studied, and to possess caves and underground rivers that for beauty and power rank first among their counterparts. So he was very critical, and it went even worse in Petermann's Mitteilungen, which was the most famous geographical journal, I would say, in the 19th century. Martel Books Les Abîmes, which was published in 1894, was even hailed as the new standard work on karst phenomena, surpassing Cvijic's little piece. The German word is Werkchen, but what is not very, very nice when you say to somebody he has made a Werkchen. So, but of course, Cvijić got a lot of support, and he got support from his teacher Penck and the close cycle of Penck's PhD students. For them, gaining a foothold in the amateurish karst research was an opportunity to establish an international reputation in the developing field of geomorphology. So they argued that karst research, which was done by amateurs and so on, needs much more professionalization, and this professionalization should be done, of course, by physical geographers and not by geologists or amateurs. So, and just 1 year after Cvijić published his PhD thesis, Penck published a very important work, The Morphology of the Earth's Surface, 2 volumes, where he very strongly supported Cvijic's thesis. And Cvijić, shortly after, I think it was 2 months after his PhD defense, he became already professor in Belgrade. He moved to Belgrade, and he there made a very fast career in the university system, becoming president of the university and then president of the Serbian Academy of Sciences. And what did Cvijić? Cvijić started to publish not longer in German, because he wanted to create a sort of national community, and there was really a very strong, how to say, conflict, continuing conflict, especially with these Viennese geologists. So Cvijić started to publish in German, in Serbian, and then also in French. So no longer any books or works in German. In the same time, besides this academic discourse, there were a lot of school maps, wall maps produced, postcards, photographs, who really also established this model of caste within the empire. And you see here a very famous depiction of a typical caste landscape with tow lines between Cesana and Lipica in the 24th volume Encyclopedia, Die Österreich-Ungarische Monarchie in Wort and Bild. And this is what I pointed out earlier. You see here a caste landscape which is a desert and with no humans. So ready for Habsburg cultivation, for Habsburg colonization. Yeah. So let's go on. What happened with Cvijić's work afterwards? He had a lucky day when a very famous geographer from Harvard decided to join the excursion of Penck to Bosnia. And this was William Morris Davis. Davis incorporated many of Cvijić's findings into his later prominent cycle of erosion theory, and Cvijić also tried to implement this idea of Davis in his later work in the 1980s. And this support of Davis was very crucial for being accepted in the international community. And there was also very strong support by European power politics before World War I, because Serbia became very strong relations with France. And Cvijić also worked as a diplomat. He was sent by the Serbian minister, president, I think it was president and the minister. He was sent abroad to forge collaborations with Bulgaria, Romania, and of course with France. And after the Habsburg annexation of Bosnia, Cvijić became really one of the fiercest Serbian critics of Austria-Hungary and got deeply involved in politics and turned his attention to France. And during the First World War, Cvijić became a visiting professor at the Sorbonne and a very close friend of Emmanuel de Marton. Emmanuel de Marton was the geographer at the University of at the Sorbonne in Paris, and also a key science advisor during the Paris Peace Conferences. And this was really the gate opener for Cvijić. And Cvijić brought to this Paris Peace Conferences his ethnographical maps of the Balkan Peninsula, where he tried to claim a sort of, Serbian dominance in later Yugoslavia. So Cvijić became really responsible for drawing the boundaries of in southeastern Europe. So let's come now to the conclusion. I would like to give you two take-home messages. My first question is, was caste geomorphology an effective tool for empire building? Indeed, between 1850s and the 1880s, the caste model served as an effective tool for intra-imperial governance and legitimizing Habsburg colonial claims in southeastern Europe. However, with the increasing nationalization of the scientific landscape, it lost its integrative power. By around 1900, geoscientists like Jovan Cvijić increasingly relied on ethnographical surveys and maps to advance their national political claims. My second question is, what role did ecological thinking and Orientalism in the natural sciences play in this process? In the case of the ministry official Josepha Lorenza, his engagement likely stemmed from a genuine scientific interest. At the same time, he provided a compelling rationale for the expansion of Habsburg imperial rule and the economic exploitation of these terrains, guided by a new scientifically grounded approach to geography and the forestry agricultural sciences. Thank you so much for your attention.